This is lecture 53B in the ABCs of Communism, Bolshevism 2017 series. Although, as I mentioned before, this particular lecture and chapter upon which it's based will be in next year's third volume on Communism in East Asia. At any rate, last time we talked about the we went from the primitive communist period up through the establishment of imperial feudalism and what Mr. Clavel calls the Toranaga shogunate, and the actual name is Tokugawa. The important point there, if you've had a chance to read all of that material, was to see how when the military dictatorship emerged under the one shogun, one military dictator, Toranaga, Tokugawa, depending on which terminology you prefer to use. Now, in the succeeding 250 years, more or less, the entire preparation for capitalism was there within the feudal period. And what it required was a stimulus. In other words, Japan was something like a seed waiting for the rain, or alternatively, perhaps like a solution that you may remember from your chemistry experiments, where you're just waiting for a catalyst to propel the chemical reaction that's already inherent in the system. The social shock of opening Japan's ports began with Commodore Perry's visit in 1853, and that visit was easily absorbed economically. The early Meiji period saw extant bureaucracy import new institutions and technology to suit the needs and conditions of Japan. However, it was a shock to the ideology of feudal Japan that could not be accepted. So it was not long after Perry's arrival that the actual shogunate government was overthrown. Its cabinet was called the Bakufu, and during the period of the shogunate of Toranaga or Tokugawa, many if not all of the most important feudal families had become involved in mercantile capitalism. Now, they were aware of what true capitalism was in terms of manufacturing, but they were allergic to it and did not want it, and much the same as the Spanish rulers did in their period of time. They wanted to keep capitalism, as you recall, outside of Spanish frontiers to the degree that it was possible, and they were successful in doing so. But at any rate, in Japan, these ruling families were well aware of what this true capitalism was all about. They didn't want it, but the de facto preparation had already occurred, and government employees, intellectuals, businessmen, engineers, rural landlords, and even civil rights activists had all gotten involved in the mercantile aspect of the thing. In the feudal period, private entrepreneurs were constantly rising and falling as they started new businesses, and entrepreneurship was not limited to wealthy merchants or samurai families, but included many newcomers who did not readily fit into the social structure, the social hierarchy of that time. So shifts and reversals of fortune among them were fierce, and this is not a new pattern to us. We've seen this everywhere where capitalism emerges out of feudalism, out of slavery through a period of feudal intermediary activity. Now, industrial promotion was the slogan in Meiji Japan, but it was not just a government slogan. By Meiji Japan, we mean the Emperor Meiji, who had come to power and who had committed himself to the capitalist order. Now, the shogunate cabinet, called the Bakufu, forced open the country and suppressed the opposition, but the unequal treaties that it had been forced to allow undermined its authority, and these treaties sparked devastating monetary inflation and became the trigger for the overthrow of the feudal Bakufu regime in terms of the actual mechanics. You want to think of this, that when Commodore Perry showed up outside of Tokyo Harbor, he had 2 ironclad steel warships and 2 clipper ships, all of which were heavily armed, and he simply said, look, either open up and give us your coal, we'll buy it, or we'll take it. And it was not possible for them to resist, and so they did. Now that was the stimulus, the catalyst that we were waiting for. Now, The end of the Bakufu regime, on the other hand, did not put an end to antagonistic contradictions between important elements of society, and during the Meiji period, being on friendly terms with high-ranking officials was as indispensable as it always had been as far as wealthy businessmen were concerned, and in addition to gaining assistance, they obtained prior knowledge of planned changes in policies, and they were able to act for them or against them, and accordingly, whenever certain wealthy class persons gained advantage, others of that class lost out. So, for no good reason, and having been too slow on the handout of necessary bribes. So, in 1874, the government suddenly notified merchants, for example, that official deposits that the collateral required had increased from 1/3 to the deposit of the total amount. Now, the government demanded that the difference be paid in less than 2 months. Now, this was important because keepers of official deposits made huge profits because they did not have to pay interest on these deposits. Now, Mitsui was able to obtain this information in advance. Bribery for information had always been the practice in pre-1853 times and continued to be until the present day. Now, there were 7 pretty, I think, most important preparatory steps during the feudal period of preparation. The first was that political stability and unity under the Tokugawa administration had been achieved. There had been a growth in agricultural expansion of farmable land in the pre-feudal and early feudal period, and in the rising productivity in the late feudal period. Now, the establishment of a communications and transportation network had been accomplished, and the integration of the national economy had been accomplished. Incipient commodity production in the capitalist way was underway, but it was carefully controlled. Further commerce evolution and its concomitant financing had happened. Accordingly, emerging an affluent merchants class was present. And sixth, the official promotion of industries, especially at the level of local governments, the governments called Han, H-A-N. And finally, the seventh, the spread of education through Bakufu and Han schools, private academies, and Terakoya private schools for children. All of this had become standard practice. The endogenous growth of commerce was the essential factor in preparation for the capitalist stage. On the other hand, the suppression of private sector activity through artificial constraints imposed by the government certainly did occur, and it continued to be possible, and these included various types of regulatory control, monopolies, exclusive cartels, excessive and unpredictable taxation, and misappropriation of the nation's wealth by those in power. A case study in point of such activity that continues to the present day is the way the U.S. government acted against me and Jason Smith Petroleum Corporation in my book. You can see there over my right shoulder, I think, that's just been published, called The Eunuch Wars. That's volume 8 in the Idaho Smith Search for the Foundation series. For those of you who are interested, now available at Amazon in paperback. At any rate, going back to the feudal period, at a mercantile perspective, the rise and fall of long-distance trade has been observed throughout history. First of all, depending on the ecological and geographical conditions of the region and the kind of government that existed, the Industrial Revolution of the latter half of the 1800s, associated with technological innovation, was an event that grew out of the successful development of a mercantile economy. However, a new problem arose with the advent of the Industrial Revolution. Commerce and finance are activities that are naturally arising within the market mechanism, but labor, on which the success of industrialization critically depends, is not dealt with well. The market economy exhibits a natural tendency to evolve from commerce to manufacturing. Secondly, the success of this evolution is not guaranteed. And thirdly, traders and merchants are the key players in this evolution, while the government must also play an important supplementary role. But if the government fails to fulfill its responsibility, or even engages in harmful activity, it will still hinder the expansion of the market economy. Now, from the Edo period, which is the shogunate period, to Meiji, what happened in terms of economic development? Well, in feudal Japan, the use of sea routes allowed nationally integrated markets to be established. And then, thanks to a vibrant economy, a class of wealthy merchants with sufficient capital in their hands emerged, and finally a distribution system for goods, along with the supporting financial system, had been developed with Osaka at its center. Now, these systemic developments were geographically limited to Japan itself, that is, within the country, but they constituted the very ingredients needed to fire an industrial revolution. Meanwhile, central and local governments in the feudal period continued their support of trade and industry. National and local government revenue came from tax in kind levied on rice. Now, this was collected and redirected for sale to consuming regions. When the Tokugawa administration was established in AD 1600, in addition to Osaka and Kyoto, which were already major cities with significant production capacity, a large urban area for consumption was created artificially in the new shogunate capital in Edo. Now, in Edo, resettled samurai who traditionally had not been engaged in production suddenly became engaged. This meant that the functioning of the Edo economy had to have a nationally integrated distribution network. To support this system, the feudal government at Edo introduced policies for sea routes and the provision of highways. Now, furthermore, what had come to exist under the feudal system was what they called the alternate attendant system. This was identical to what the French ruling class king had established at Versailles, which required all of the nobles to live there. Now, in Japan, they were required to spend 1 year out of every 2 in Edo, so that the secret police could keep an eye on them. Because you need these people, because somebody has to be the administrator of all of these peasants, all of these farmers. And so in both France and Japan, that turned out to be the extant nobility. But on the other hand, if these people are allowed to make money and have it in their own hands, they're going to constantly plot against the king, or in Japan's case, against the shogun. So on the other hand, in Edo, what you had here was a brand new base of consumers, because one of the ways you keep these nobles under control, whether it's in Egypt, in the nome system, or in France and Versailles, they're all the same. They all have the same process at this time. You have to keep them in debt, and one of the ways you keep them in debt is to encourage them to spend a lot of money. In fact, all of their money, if that's at all possible. So you've created a big market there at Edo that didn't exist before. That's what he means, or what we mean by artificially created market. Now, in promoting private commercial activities, the policies of the central government remained highly inconsistent throughout the Edo period. That is, throughout this feudal period where they were concentrated, where the government was at Edo. Just as soon as it had officially recognized and even enforced trade cartels, I'm going to skip the Japanese words because they're not easy to pronounce, and I don't think they mean anything to you. It would ban them and return to an economy with free entry and competition. As for the taxation of commerce, it was extremely arbitrary and unpredictable. The production base steadily switched from rice production to commercial crops and handicraft industries. And then it shifted onto trade based on commercial crops and handicraft industries. Tax inconsistency meant that the government did not create a stable tax base and consequently ran continuous fiscal deficits. The debasement of gold and silver coins to finance the fiscal deficit gave rise to inflation. In other words, if you start adding lead to your gold coins or silver coins and whatever to make it go farther, of course they're going to be worth less, because people will bite into those coins and they'll find out pretty quick, uh-oh, this is about half lead. However, even so, a national commercial activity thrived. Now, locally, governments addressed fiscal crisis by encouraging industry at the regional level, and some successfully cleared their deficits. Japan had a closed-door policy from the early Tokugawa days until a year after Perry's visit. Japan's feudal hierarchy, reinforced by the expulsion of foreign ideological sabotage, that is, by all these Christian priests that Toranaga in the movies and Tokugawa in reality got rid of as soon as they possibly could in the very early years of the shogunate. The agricultural sector generated a reliable surplus. The commercial and handicraft businesses developed as the lords and their henchmen engaged in trade among adjacent regions, and the sea routes connecting these regions created a nationally integrated market. The national economy steadily grew, and this remarkable economic development spanned more than 200 years. At the end of the feudal period, a systemic gap had matured between a tax base dependent on rice farming and the dynamic reality of commodity production. A stimulus was needed to overcome this contradiction and propel the Japanese economy to the next stage of development. And for Japan, that stimulus came with Commodore Perry's 1853 visit. Now, catching up was a national goal, and it was a joint effort of both government and business as far as the Meiji government was concerned, and accordingly it set its policy along those lines. These were remarkably clear and deadly earnest policies. The goals were proposed by the government and shared by the whole nation, including the political opposition. Immediately after the opening of Japan to the rest of the world, the national priority was security-oriented and defensive, namely to avoid colonization and to protect sovereignty. The Japanese had become well aware of what had happened in Indonesia, that is the Spice Islands, and in China, and they were determined to prevent that from happening to them. And they had gained enough breathing space that if they did the right things, they could avoid colonization by the imperialist powers. With time, and as the threat of being subjugated by the great powers diminished, the national goals took on the more positive aim of making Japan a first-class power to rank equal with the West, to make Japan great again. These goals were summarized in the famous phrase, Fukoku Kyohei, or enriching the country and strengthening the military. It's important to understand the acute inferiority Japan must have felt as it encountered countries clearly more powerful than itself, as well as grasped the simultaneous surge of pride that urged it on to overcome its backwardness. Nationalism grew because of Japan's contact with the outside world, following its long seclusion and the shock of discovering that it was merely a backward country in the world system. The desire to catch up, backed by a fierce national pride, strongly colored the history of Japan for the following half-century, ending with the Pacific War against Tsarist capitalist Russia. In the early years of Meiji, conflicting policy lines on how to become a first-class power were already apparent within the government. There were four major issues that concerned the high officials of the Meiji government. The first was industrialization on the economic front, Shokusan Kugyo, or industrial promotion. The first policy, industrialization, was advocated and implemented by Toshimichi Okubo, who was successively in office as Minister of Finance and then as Home Secretary. Home Secretary is the top cop. After his assassination in 1878, Shigenobu Okuma and Kiyotaka Kuroda inherited this policy line. Secondly, the expansionist policy on the international front, for example, Sekanron, or the argument for the Korean expedition, Takamori Saigo and Taisuke Itagaki proposed the second policy, and behind it lay the strong sense of danger that if the dissatisfaction of disaffected samurai was not deflected externally, the new government would not last long. However, because of stern opposition from Okubo and Takayoshi Kido to the military expedition, the counselors who made up the Korea expedition faction were forced to leave the government in 1876. Now, after this event, Saigo was exalted as the leader of the disaffected samurai groups, and this led to an uprising against the government, the Satsuma Rebellion, which is what that movie of Tom Cruise's called The Last Samurai is all about. Meanwhile, Itagaki and his followers started an anti-government offensive as the self-proclaimed leaders of the civil rights movement, what they called the civil rights movement. Now, third, the establishment of a constitutional government on the political front, meaning a constitution and a parliament, was the third most important policy goal of the Meiji regime. Inoue and Ito, that is Kaoru Inoue and Hirobumi Ito, prepared this third policy of political reform from within the government. Now, their plan stressed gradualism and aimed at the Prussian model of a constitutional monarchy, as opposed to the more advanced British type of constitutional democracy with a party government. Now, Shigenobu Okuma, who proposed the latter model, was forced from power during the crisis of 1881. From outside the government, however, Itagaki, who had left public office, joining other civil rights campaigners like Kenkichi Katoka and Emori Ueki, then called for radicalism. Now, by civil rights, they're not talking about a mass of people, farmers or workers, which don't yet really exist in factories. They're talking about civil rights among the different contending wealthy families. The popular movement called for the immediate introduction of a parliament and prepared private drafts of a constitution, and it spread like wildfire through the country, politicizing wealthy farmers and poor peasants alike, and at times it turned quite violent. And the fourth policy goal of the Meiji regime was the revision of the unequal treaties with the West. Now, the question of sequencing and political wrangling among the elites was not a single confrontation over fundamentally incompatible goals. It was rather an ongoing argument over how to set priorities and the sequence in which the country should realize mutually agreed upon common goals. It was a confusing process where the same person drove forward opposing policies in quick succession. Political alliances would form and dissolve depending on the issue at hand. For example, Okubo, who opposed Saigo's expansionism and ousted the Korea expedition faction in 1876, turned around and dispatched troops to Taiwan in the following year. And in 1878 he sent a battleship to Korea. Itagaki, who had resigned criticizing the Meiji government, later returned to the government, only to leave it once again. So, at any rate, constitutional government and nationalism is the next topic, and in 1871, a high-level mission headed by Tomomi Iwakura, and including about half of the government ministers, was sent to the U.S. and Europe for nearly 2 years, and its purpose was to, 1, conduct preliminary negotiations for the revision of the unequal treaties. Now this failed. The capitalist powers using the excuse that Japan did not qualify for equal status due to its backward national institutions. Now secondly, Japan's second objective was to seek Western technology and systems, and in this it did succeed, because it fit in with imperialist designs to transform the Japanese into willing puppets. Now, upon the return of the Iwakura mission, Toshimichi Okubo, one of the principal mission members, wrote a document he titled A Proposal for Constitutional Government, and its purpose was to satisfy the imperialist demands for institutions qualified in their minds with whom to do business. So, and most importantly, to give the Japanese burgeoning bourgeoisie a framework within which to mature. In Okubo's thesis, democratic government and monarchy both have their advantages and disadvantages. Obviously, democracy, meaning equality for the bourgeoisie, in its ideal form, is superior to monarchy. In reality, it often disintegrates, he says, into factionalism. In the worst case, it descends into tyranny of the great unwashed masses, who brutally suppress their betters in a reign of terror, as in France and Europe after the French Revolution and the advent of Bonapartism. On the other hand, a monarchy functions well where the ruler is wise and the people are unenlightened. When the ruler is tyrannical, the officials corrupt, the misery and the resentment of the ordinary burghers will be limitless. Compared to England, Japan is only semi-civilized and cannot rid itself of the customs of feudalism. Now, for us, Okubo says, monarchy in the form of the Tokugawa reign is already outdated. However, preparations to install a democratic system immediately are incomplete. Thus, to carry the various reforms through with resolve, the central government should maintain a strong position as the mainstay of policy making. Now, the realistic path for Japan, he said, was to introduce a constitutional monarchy based on the principle of the gradual installment of a constitutional government adjusted to the speed of social change. This, for the moment, means joint governing by the emperor and the people under a constitution. In contrast to Okubo's argument, Yukichi Fukuzawa, another intellectual leader of the Meiji period, makes two assertions. The first creates categories in his 1875 outline of the theory of civilization. Therein, each country is civilized, partially civilized, or uncivilized, and Japan is semi-civilized. And secondly, the relative merits and demerits of democracy as opposed to monarchy cannot be correctly analyzed in general and must be analyzed specifically. And he advocated that Japan cast away its traditions and customs and adopt Western civilization to its advantage. Fukuzawa wants the capitalists to rule. Okubo prefers rule by high officials with a grand vision. Their endeavors will accelerate the pace of material civilization by applying the strong hands of the central government. Well, in reality, in history, how did it progress? How did these four policy objectives mature? Well, first of all, from the earliest years of the Meiji Revolution, economic development was successfully pursued through government policies. Now, these policies were administered through the Ministry of Industry, the Ministry of Finance, and the Home or Police Ministry. 2. As for the expansionist campaign, it was at first set back because of the expulsion of the Korea Expedition faction in 1876. However, militarism subsequently gained in force as Japan repeatedly waged war to secure its interests abroad and add to its colonies. Thirdly, as for the establishment of a constitution, this proceeded in line with the gradualist approach of the government. In response to the growing civil rights movement in 1881, the Meiji government announced through an imperial order that a parliament would be inaugurated within 10 years. Thereafter, Hirobumi Ito and Kaoru Inoue conducted research on constitutional systems and prepared a draft constitution which was deliberated by the Privy Council. In 1889, the leadership enacted a constitution as promised, and in the following year, the first imperial parliament opened. This happened 22 years into the Meiji Revolution. Now, fourth and finally, the unequal treaties issue was resolved by Japan's victory against Russia in the 1904 war. Military might secured a de facto equal status for Japan with the cap powers. Now, in your book, I picked several people to take a look at because their particular history is instructive with regard to the evolution of the Meiji Revolution. But here I'm only going to talk about one or two. Aichi Shibusawa is one of them in 1869, 4 years after the end of the U.S. Civil War. And 1 year into the Meiji Revolution, Aichi Shibusawa entered the new Ministry of Finance. His assigned task was to lay the foundations for a market economy. And the program he introduced was the joint stock company system. It was accompanied by a unified monetary system, a new system of weights and measures, a railway line, and nationally chartered banks. The Tomioka textile factory was one of the first manifestations. We're going to come back to that shortly. He managed the finance ministry for 4 years from 1869 to 1873, and incidentally he did this while he was between the ages of 29 and 33. Anyway, Aichi Shibusawa did not like being a bureaucrat, and 4 years was more than enough for him. He left the finance ministry to become head of the First National Bank of Japan. This is a bank he created and continued as its boss until his death at the age of 91. Through this commanding height, his efforts created a myriad of enterprises, economic organizations, and social entities. Shibusawa did not form his own zaibatsu, that is, corporation, and had less interest in expanding his business empire. He was a market major player, but stayed at least one step removed from it. Accordingly, he acted as a business promoter and dedicated his life into forming Japan into a modern economy. When he called for the establishment of a new organization, his motive was not profit or market share, but the fact that Japan needed such an activity. Shibusawa's business philosophy was neither that of the self-seeking individual nor the utilitarian, but one that unites economics and ethics, and the latter of which was his interpretation of the Analects of Confucianism. Shibusawa was quick to perceive the needs of the Japanese economy and was the type to instantly act to fulfill them. In setting up a business, his usual practice was to proclaim himself as an investor in a newly established joint stock company and urge other men of substance to invest with him until sufficient funds were collected. In this manner, Shibusawa was involved in the establishment of more than 500 companies. He was also largely involved in the establishment of other economic organizations, universities, and welfare institutions, and furthermore, as a private emissary, he made strenuous efforts to improve Japan-U.S. relations as dark clouds began to gather. Of course, for a single man to be involved personally in so many activities is physically impossible, and in fact, in many cases, it was just his name that was led to the project. He did not intervene deeply in day-to-day management of any of these 500 companies, Only when a problem arose did he offer necessary support and dispatch advice. He was born, that is, Shibusawa was born in 1840 in what is now Fukayo City in Saitama Prefecture. He was the eldest son of a wealthy farmer who traded in indigo. From his youth, he was a shrewd businessman and stood up to local officials that tried to collect funds for so-called official purposes, which is just a way of extorting bribery. Before long, the young Shibusawa became resentful of the absurdity of the feudal system and burned with a patriotic desire to overthrow the Tokugawa administration and to expel foreigners. He had planned to attack Takasaki Castle and from there storm the foreign settlement in Yokohama to set alight the mansions of the foreign residents. However, this plan fell through and the 23-year-old Shibusawa fled with his companions to Kyoto. In Kyoto, he made the acquaintance of and then served Yoshinobu Hitotsubashi, one of the most illustrious relatives of the ruling Tokugawa family. Even here, Shibusawa was quick to reform the military system, a system for the Hitotsubashi family, encourage industry in the territory, and issue local money that circulated with a lot of confidence. Shortly after, in a strange turn of events, Yoshinobu was promoted to shogun, and before Shibusawa knew it, he had been transformed from an anti-Tokugawa campaigner into a retainer of the Tokugawa family. However, Shibusawa knew that the Tokugawa administration was doomed to collapse before long because the feudal order it represented was full of rot. As his analysis became known, given time, the regime would regard him as a traitor and he would end up on the losing side. And he recognized this and was despondent. It said that he spent his days dissatisfied and enjoying nothing. But soon the opportunity arose of going to France, and for him it was time to exit stage left, and he did. He secured a spot as an attendant with the official delegation to the Paris International Exposition. He was to serve the 14-year-old Akitake Tokugawa, who went to study abroad. Shibusawa happily departed for Europe with him. Finally, however, the Tokugawa government did collapse. Rushing back home, Shibusawa decided to live a quiet life in Shizuoka near the unfortunate Yoshinobu, who had been forced there. However, he was not the type to sit still for long, and he proposed that the local government of Shizuoka use funds provided by the new government to develop the regional economy by establishing joint stock companies, and this proposal was instantly adopted. Companies established with Shibusawa's assistance were the First National Bank, Oji Paper, Japan Railway, Kyoto Transportation, Osaka Spinning Mill, Tokyo Gas, Japan Mail Shipping, Imperial Hotel, Sapporo Beer, Japan Sugar Refining, Oriental Shipping, Keihan Electric Railway, Tokyo Electric Power, and NKK. Shibusawa helped to create the Tokyo Commercial School, later to become Hitotsubashi University, the Tokyo Bankers Association, the Tokyo Chamber of Commerce, the Tokyo Stock Exchange, Japan's Women's College, Tokyo Clearinghouse, Tokyo Municipal Orphanage, Imperial Theater, Japan's Anti-Tuberculosis Association, and the Tokyo Women's University. Shibusawa was not a farmer, merchant, or samurai. He was the unique product of a tumultuous period in Japan's history. He was a keen observer and was highly sensitive to irrationalities and inefficiencies. If he noticed any such problems, he would immediately suggest a solution and take a lead in transforming it into action. Where obstacles existed, he did not relent until he overcame them. He was able to respond to any change in circumstances, and he did not tolerate emotional attachment to the past, undue formalism, or red tape bureaucracy. And besides that, Shibusawa was a womanizer. With a man packed solid with such energy, that would be hard to avoid, I suppose. And the Japanese had economy, in short, the Japanese economy had no choice but to develop. So Japan emerged as Asia's representative major power at the end of the 1800s. It achieved in less than 5 decades the process of transforming from an agricultural and feudal society to a full-fledged industrial and capitalist country that protected Japan from the clutches of Western imperialism. Leaders of the Meiji capitalist revolution include some of the following, and I'm going to mention one more here. Yamagata Aritomo, coming from a low-ranking samurai family, he became widely known for his efforts in modernizing the Japanese military. An educated youth, he showed interest in the military affairs and had a progressive vision in that matter. Later, his interest coincided with that of the Meiji government. He played an important role in the modernization of the Japanese Imperial Army for the sake of protecting Japan's independence and pushing its interests across the seas. He was born in 1838. His family lived in Choshu Domain. His father was an intellectual, educated the young Yamagata Aritomo in both literature and martial arts, and in the 1860s, like many in the Choshu Domain, he supported the cause of the restoration of imperial power, that is, Meiji. And by 1868, the ruling Tokugawa shogunate fell, and Japan began a process of industrialization and westernization under the slogan, "Rich country, strong army," and the reign of Emperor Meiji. He actively pursued the modernization of the Japanese army. In 1870, he became the Vice Minister of Military Affairs, and in the following year he went on a mission to Europe and the USA to study their military forces. He concluded in his 1871 return that the Prussian military provided the best model for Japan. From 1872 until 1878, and again from 1894 to 1895, he was War Minister. He promoted conscription as the source of manpower for the military. That doesn't sound so radical, but in the Japanese circumstances it was, because traditionally the military had been run by samurai. And now what you're saying is we'll get a bunch of ignorant peasant boys out there and teach them how to be soldiers. In 1878, he applied the Prussian General Staff system that separated administration from the military command. He also sent Japanese officers to European countries to study modern warfare. His initial reforms in the army proved to be a success when it defeated the Satsuma Rebellion in 1877. After becoming War Minister, he became a Chief of Staff of the Army until 1882, and again in 1884 to 1885, under which he supported the Emperor's imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors. The rescript detailed the duties of the soldiers, such as following 5 principles, which were loyalty, propriety, righteousness, and simplicity. Later he became the Home Minister, that is the Police Minister, in 1883, and he held it until 1889. Home Minister is Japan's title for what other countries call their Internal Security Minister, that is top cop. Accordingly, he created Japan's police force, including its first secret police department. He was able to make local governments subservient to his cops. From 1889 to 1893, Aritomo was a fascist kind of attorney general, bringing the police and courts under his rule. As such, he created the most important single fascist institution for the post-1904 fascist regime. During his second tenure as War Minister, he led Japan to victory during the Sino-Japanese War. As the 1900s unfolded, Yamagata was working as top cop and generalissimo for the Meiji Emperor, and in that capacity became president of the Privy Council in 1905 and until 1909, and part of a group of elder statesmen who were called Genro, G-E-N-R-O. And in 1908 he held the titles of Field Marshal and the high noble title of Prince. Now, the Army of Fascist Japan. The Yamagata Aritomo passed away on February 1st, 1922. He was one of the founders of Fascist Japan and shaped what it wanted as its modern Japanese army. The internal strength of the Army of Fascist Nippon was misleading as to its actual power because of its very nature. Inherently, it relied upon blind, suicidal obedience on the part of troops. The same kind of obedience demanded from its urbanized proletariat and totally subservient farming classes. Obedience and discipline, as important as they are not substitutes for science and mechanization. The 1939 defeat of Japan's army suffered at the hands of Zhukov's Siberian army at Khalkhin was the inevitable result. Now take a look at one more important person. Matsukata Masayoshi, born in 1835 in Satsuma Domain to a lowly samurai family. However, that was enough status to allow him a proper education. Later he worked as a clerk handling the finances of the reigning clan in Satsuma, and he attained knowledge of trade and finance because of this work. In addition to gaining financial skills, he also met during the course of his work one of Japan's most important intellectual leaders, Okubo Toshimichi, who we just reviewed, and so it was not a surprise that Matsukata joined the imperial faction that desired the downfall of the ruling Tokugawa shogunate. After the Meiji government succeeded in taking over the country, the government gave Matsukata numerous posts over the following years. He did his job as the governor of Ita quite well, and he also took part in reforming the land tax system of the country. The most important work assigned to him was as part of the Japanese delegation to plan for Japan's participation in the Paris World's Fair. There he had conversations with French Finance Minister Leon Say. Say influenced Matsukata with the liberal economic ideas of laissez-faire, with no government participation in the economy, as well as liberal monetarist theory in finance. These ideas became manifest during his time as finance minister. Then, in the late 1870s, Japan's government faced bankruptcy. Matsukata Masayoshi engineered the salvation of Japanese capitalist industrialization, placing it in a much stronger position than it had been. From 1881 until 1892, Matsukata was the finance minister of Japan, and as finance minister he had to solve Japan's rising inflation and incoherent finances. He initiated a policy of forcing price decreases. This deflation solved the problem of inflation in a single stroke. He created the nation's central bank, named the Bank of Japan, and he saw that numerous banks printed too much paper money, and that had caused the inflation. So under his financial ministerial rule, the Bank of Japan was the only one that could print and issue paper money, and thereby the regime controlled the amount of fiat flowing into the economy. Matsukata sold many government-run enterprises that had accumulated losses instead of profits, and by selling these businesses, the government stopped the losses from these enterprises and took back some of the capital invested, and the overall result was a rescue from its bankruptcy. By 1886, his measure had worked. Japan had a balanced budget and low inflation through the following decade. Japan's industrialization was stronger than ever, and however, deflation was devastating for farmers. For one reason, the monetary value of goods decreased, but the amount of their taxes remained high because taxes were calculated separately from income. And we'll come back to that in a moment. From 1891 to 1898, Matsukata was twice appointed prime minister. His style of handling the premiership was autocratic. He had no liking for politics, hated opposition. He relied on the time, tried, and true use of bribes. And if that proved insufficient, a little strong-arm intimidation got him what he wanted. And for that reason, the more negotiation-inclined wealthy families got him removed twice. In 1901, Matsukata retired. He moved to the Privy Council and became a general, or elderly statesman, advising the government in financial matters. In 1904, as is often the case, war resolved the issues confronting the ruling families. Japan came out of the war with Russia victorious and committed to formal fascism. And now we'll take a look again in more detail at Okubo Toshimichi. He was born in 1830 in Satsuma Domain. He also came from a low-status samurai family, but nevertheless they were samurai, and again this had meant that they had sufficient status so that if they had the money, they could ensure him or any boy an education. Okubo Toshimichi became a pillar of Japan's transformation, and he supported a wide range of changes in society, local administration, and economy. The young Okubo loved literature, and through this route he came under the guidance of a prominent samurai in Satsuma named Saigo Takamori. He and his mentor worked and fought together for the emperor and later collaborated in administering the country. In 1849, Okubo's family sided with the wrong faction in a succession battle, and that had led to their exile from Satsuma. In 1851, the new head of the Satsuma domain was persuaded to allow Okubo to return. He then worked closely with the head of Satsuma domain, Shimazu Nariakira. By 1858, he had become an expert in land tax, and so he became a tax collector. Now, after Great Britain's steel warships bombarded Kagoshima, Okubo began to see the failed nature of the Tokugawa shogunate. After the Tokugawa regime launched a campaign to crush the anti-Tokugawa Chosu domain and failed, Okubo, along with Saigo Takamori, decided to switch sides. In 1866, Okubo and Saigo formed an alliance between Satsuma and Choshu samurais and the imperial court to overthrow the Tokugawa shogunate. Their imperial faction emerged as the victor in the ensuing civil war. 2 years later, in 1868, the Meiji Revolution began. Okubo worked tirelessly for the Meiji government's plan for Japan's transformation to independence. He promoted reforms in the conduct and traditions of the imperial court, as well as in local administration, society, and economy, and he followed the slogan of "Rich Country, Strong Army." In 1871, he enthusiastically supported industrialization of the economy, as well as the westernization of Japanese society, while working in the home or police ministry. In that capacity, he contributed to the shift from the feudal domain system to the capitalist regime's modern prefectural system that they preferred. He wrote the new police laws for Japanese society, such as the banning of wearing swords in public. Concomitants were the abolition of strict adherence and discrimination of Confucian social castes. In the same year, he took part of the Iwakura mission to renegotiate the unequal treaties with the European countries of the United States. Now, this banning of wearing swords in public, was effectively disarming the samurai as a class, and that had far-reaching ramifications. In 1873, Okubo became Home Minister, that is, top cop, police minister. At that time, he worked with the finance minister Okubo Shigenobu and Matsukata Masayoshi in reforming the land tax systems. Now, farmers finally got relief when the new crew changed taxation to a percentage of the price of the tilled land. So it no longer was calculated separately from the value of the rice. Along the way, he also supported the gradual transition of the Meiji government to a constitutional monarchy. As top cop, or home minister, he suppressed revolts, including the suppression of a samurai rebellion in the Saga domain, and it happened this way. In 1877, he had to crush a rebellion of an old friend and ally, Saigo Takamori. Saigo led the disgruntled samurais in Satsuma domain. An argument between Okubo and Saigo, when Saigo wanted Japan to invade Korea, had occurred. Now, Okubo, along with other ministers, disagreed. Their disagreement wasn't based on anything other than the fact that they thought Japan was still too weak militarily to accomplish this. But at any rate, the disarmament of the samurai and the loss of their social status had already angered Saigo to the boiling point. The political decision not to invade Korea was the last straw, and he decided to lead a doomed last-stand rebellion. In the climactic battle, Saigo and his colleagues died. The Tom Cruise movie The Last Samurai is an excellent reenactment of this final victory of capitalism over feudalism in Japan. On May 14, 1878, 6 samurai in Tokyo's Akasaka district assassinated Okubo. They stabbed him to death for his role in ending the Satsuma rebellion. One more character we should take a close look at this point is Ito Irobumi, born in 1841 with the name of Hayashi Shonsuke in the Choshu domain. In other words, he had a different name when he was born. He came from the lowest productive caste of traditional Japanese society, the field farmers. His parents sold him to samurai, who agreed to give the boy what advantage they could, and these were what advantage he could. And these were the last days of the shogunate, and any samurai who could stay sober and work could manage to get an education for his son. So it came to pass that at the age of 14, a low-ranking samurai had adopted him, and Hayashi Shonsuke acquired the last name of Ito, I-T-O. With his adopted samurai family, he received a good education, and along the way, their samuraiism inculcated in him the value of loyalty to Japan. Thus, Ito Hirobumi was able to take advantage of this life opportunity and rose to become Japan's first prime minister. In 1859, 17-year-old Ito went to Edo, that is the capital of the shogunate, in its period of rapid decline under the ruling Tokugawa shogunate. At that time, the threat of Western imperialism loomed everywhere around the seas of Japan. The Dutch from Indonesia, the French from Indochina, the UK from India, the U.S. once again, its civil war concluded, and its affairs in Latin America resolved, now turned its attention back to Japan. So in 1861, the head of the Choshu domain wanted to upgrade the Choshu army so it could engage imperialist crown troops successfully, and they sent Ito to Nagasaki, a longtime port, where its Dutch enclave sheltered foreign and domestic Ronin. This was not Pall Mall where particular people congregate, but it was sufficient for Ito to learn the basics of ass-kicking Western military arts and technology, and moreover he gained respect for these men and their whores, and that transformed him into an advocate of adopting their ways. Accordingly, he was ambiguous about the Brits' military bombardment of Shimonoseki. The next year, in 1861, Ito joined the militant anti-foreigners movement known as the Sonojoy. The group became involved in the burning of the Limy legation in December. During the Boshin War, Boshin, Ito sided with the capitalist cause-converted emperor. Ito's active participation resulted in his elevation to be a state councilor after the war, and he participated and supported the transformation of Japan into a westernized, modern, and industrial nation in the new Meiji capitalist revolutionary era. In the early 1860s, one of his contributions to the industrialization of Japan was participation in the planning of the construction of the Yokohama-Tokyo shipping line. In finance, he also took part in the initiation of a new land tax. In 1869, he became governor of Hyogo. While there, he changed his name from Toshisuke to Hirobumi. Ito also held the post of chief of the Bureau of Foreign Affairs and executive and government offices involving finance, administration, and industry. In 1870, Ito went to the United States to study their monetary system, and when he came back to Japan, he was made president of the Mint. And while in that capacity, he paved the way to the creation of a national currency called the yen. In 1871, Ito went to another mission abroad, this time to take part in the Iwakura mission, tasked with the renegotiations of the unequal treaties of Japan. In 1873, he became Minister of Public Works and the chairman of the Assembly of the Prefectural Governors. In this capacity, he went about cementing and improving the new system from the domain system to what Meiji now wanted, which was a modern prefecture system of local administration. In 1878, he became the Home Minister, or top cop, and he crushed the Satsuma Rebellion. In the 1880s, Ito became active in setting up Japan's constitution, so in 1882 he went to Europe to study different constitutions, and he had conversations with European legal experts like Rudolf von Gneist and Lorenz von Stein. Eventually he joined many of his colleagues in viewing the Prussian constitution as the best fit for Japan. In 1888, he put his knowledge to use when he became chairman of a commission designated to form the Japanese Constitution as part of the Meiji Constitution. The Privy Council was then formed. On 11th of February 1889, Emperor Meiji promulgated the new constitution, and meanwhile, Ito also made a mark in Japanese history as the first prime minister. In 1885 up to 1889, Ito, as Japan's first prime minister, headed up a cabinet system that replaced the initial Meiji state council system. He again became the prime minister in 1892 until 1896 and won the Sino-Japanese War, negotiating the Shimonoseki Treaty. That victory and resulting treaty was quickly followed by a renegotiation of all of Japan's unequal treaties, the fourth and final initial task of the Meiji capitalist revolution was thus complete. In 1898, Ito was at odds with the new political parties. He dissolved the parliament, showing those parties who was boss, and he resigned twice again, becoming prime minister for a fourth and final time in 1900 and 1901. In 1901, he decided to retire. In 1903, he became head of the Privy Council. The following year, 1904, Japan went to war with Russia. Britain supported Ito by helping to perfect the steel navy that gave Japan victory in that conflict. And in 1905, Ito went to Korea as its new resident general and overseer of Korea's colonization by Japan. Koreans hated him for his role in the fall of their country, and 4 years later they were able to celebrate his assassination by a Korean freedom fighter in Harbin, China. That is, on 26 October 1909, a Korean nationalist named An Chung-gun shot Ito Irogumi in Harbin, Manchuria. Ito's death was mourned in Japan, although it was celebrated in Korea. In Japan, he received a state funeral. His lasting legacy remained the Meiji Constitution that was in effect until the end of World War II. He is forever remembered as Japan's first prime minister. And I mentioned a few more people here that I'm going to skip over because I don't think it's that important. I think you got the general picture. Now what we want to spend some time on is the establishment of the capitalist industries themselves. The silk, cotton, and the machines. In 1868, Japan was an agrarian society in which farming, forestry, and fishing employed more than 70% of the working population. These people supplied 60% of national output. Trade throughout Meiji featured exports of raw silk yarn, tea, and marine products. Foreign markets for these commodities were primarily in the USA. Given the role of gringo imperialism in forcing open Japanese ports, this was to be expected. U.S. demand for these commodities ballooned thereafter, and domestic comprador capitalists in Japan greatly profited. During Meiji, all villages that could got into the business of cultivation of mulberries to feed to the silkworms, and many earned a good income. In this sense, silk made an important contribution to Japan's industrialization by earning the foreign exchange with which to buy the sinews of Japanese industrial foundations. Mines were seized and made a regime monopoly by the new government. Then the mines were sold off to the regime's private capitalist sector. What had been one of Japan's principal industries in the feudalism of the Tokugawa shogunate changed hands in Meiji capitalism. Now, with regard to the heavy industrial revolution, which of course is the foundation in the West for the entire process of capitalism, the iron and steel, shipbuilding, and chemical industries were built by imitation. Now, these industries had to become the main forces in production if Japan was to be a true capitalist country equal to the UK, USA, Italy, Germany, France, or even Russia. It was a very long road to travel to make these industries at all, and then to make them internationally competitive. Importing the necessary machinery from the West was the fastest way. Now, that importation required the cash Japan could only acquire by commodity exports supplemented by money from the sale of light manufactured industrial goods such as electrical machinery, appliances, and tools. The existing domestic production of what machinery, appliances, and tools that did exist was in the hands of state-owned enterprises, officially munitions plants like the Tokyo Artillery Factory, the Chokusaka Naval Arsenal, the Osaka Artillery Factory, and the Kure Naval Arsenal. But that at least was something, and these plants were an established open door to use the technology and machinery from the Western capitalists. By late Meiji times, private sector production in the area of shipbuilding, railway carriages, and machine instruments had emerged. Engineers and workers who handled the new technology in the state-owned munitions plants began to transmute themselves into private sector business. Better yet, for purposes of national development, entrepreneurial-minded persons began setting up their own small businesses to take subcontracts in their specialties. Now, this entrepreneurial class included women as well as men for the first time. Japanese cities harboring the munitions plants began to form a kind of Michigan archipelago in Japan. In this manner, the production technology of the West propagated widely, and small businesses and subcontractors began to form in Tokyo and Osaka. Thus, while heavy industry had only begun during the Meiji period, it was preparing itself to produce steel and big guns. It was also simultaneously preparing for a rapid leap into the period after the First World War. Now, meanwhile, Capitalist endeavor brought the greatest transformation around the success of import substitution and mechanizing the domestic cotton industry. Why? Well, true capitalism requires commodity production via the application of labor power to machinery. The world became the marketplace, so the domestic markets were joined to the markets of export-oriented production. Now, this was a gigantic step forward on the socio-cultural evolutionary ladder that, when complete, would bring Japan into the modern, that is, capitalist world. Now, the light industrial revolution is the next topic we want to take a close look at. In 1870, half of all imports came from Great Britain in the form of cotton and woolen goods and cotton yarn. Japan exported its primary commodities and imported manufactured goods. This was a typical trade pattern imposed on colonized countries by capitalist imperialism. As Japan's cotton industry grew, the import of textile products fell until in 1904 it was zero. After 1895, Japan began exporting cotton yarn and manufactured clothing to neighboring Asia. Simultaneously, Japanese capitalists began importing raw material in large quantities from India. In other words, the industrialization of the Meiji period began as a light industrial revolution, as it had in Old England and New England, once the Englishmen and their continental Protestant brethren had plentiful blast furnaces, supplied iron, and independent power. Japan was doing this simultaneously with the adoption of light industrial machinery and the machine tools with which to make these fundamentals. And of course, the factory installation of labor power for yarn and clothing had been the concomitant. In other words, Japan began with the acquisition of the same 5 essential technological elements of the capitalist stage as had occurred in Old England, in Northern Europe, and New England. Now, in Japan's particular way, it had begun with import substitution that progressed to domestic production and then on to exporting. Within this transition, cotton production played the central role. The end result had been the financing of the heavy industrial revolution. Satisfying Marx's given. Karl Marx had required 2 theoretical things for true capitalism to exist. These were discussed in ABC's Volume 1 in this series. Machinofacture was 1, and 2, the entire globe had to be the unimpeded marketplace. Now, the key word here is theoretical. Why? The key word is theoretical because in the real world this unimpeded marketplace had never existed. Nevertheless, it is essential for the Marxist theory of capitalist production and its mathematics to operate. This still remains the case today. It is the reason for the World Trade Organization, the WTO, to exist. That is, to approximate as closely as possible the second of Marx's 2 theoretical givens. In his article, Why Protective Tariffs Are Undesirable, Meiji Suda put forward the following reasons against contemporary protectionist tariffs aimed at relieving the trade deficit. These are identical to the 1868 requirements of Capital Volume 1. Meiji Japan in 1878 had comprehended this basic Marxist text. Reviewing Meiji's 5 points about 1878 protectionist tariffs, he says, first, they are impossible within trade agreements. Second, foreign goods such as iron and steel are much cheaper than domestic production, and the latter cannot be protected by tariffs alone. Domestic capitalists had to modernize, and it was their financial obligation to arrange this modernization and be competitive, not the government's. And thirdly, no factories could produce Western-style manufactured goods in Japan at that time. And fourth, it would have been counterproductive to social peace to cut off imports when the nation's population had a strong desire for imported goods. 5. Japan was backward and needed a large volume of Western products, and that was a fact of life. The government could not have realistically changed it in any other way than by encouraging modernization. And anyway, in 1878, tariff revenues amounted to only 9% of the regime's total fiscal revenue. This ratio was small when considered from the perspective of Japan's development stage at that time. So in essence, what this gentleman is saying is that we have to, the capitalists themselves are going to have to accept the costs of modernization. Tariffs don't amount to much to us anyway. They're like 29% of our revenue. So anyway, when you get the book, you want to read that several times and think about it. Engineers in command, the honest civil governance and accountability. Japan accepted that these values had to be realized. That is, engineers in command, honest civil governance, and accountability at the core of its development. They cannot be slogans meant to stupefy some to the benefit of others. Bloviating fine but fallacious abstract phrases combined with ignoring Japan's individual character and history would have been a false development strategy. What supported the wondrous mobile industrialization of Meiji Japan was not the direct import of fallacious sloganeering from the West. It was motivated individual businessmen burning with the zeal of youth who were the proud engineers who absorbed new learning like a sponge absorbs water. These engineers raced around the machines and equipped the factory floors, innovating, fixing, and improving them, and the positioning of their labor power. Japan, during the period of its Industrial Revolution, in other words, was very much like a living museum packed with energetic industrialists, and in this sense it was an exact duplication of the role of the engineer businessman in what had happened in Western Europe and North America after 1875, after 1775, and of what would happen by engineers in South America after Simón Bolívar, Bernardo O'Higgins, and San Martin. Anyway, let's take a look at an architect engineer, Takeo Yamanobe, born in 1877 as a foreign student. He went to England. In 1877 he went to England, studying economics and insurance at London University. And out of the blue, one day, he received a letter from Aichi Shibusawa, the banker we reviewed earlier. "I heard about you from a friend in Japan," the letter said. "In Japan, state-owned spinning mills are in a poor state, and the import of cotton yarn is huge. For the good of our country, it is imperative that we establish high-performing spinning mills under Japanese control. And for this to be possible, people familiar with technology and operations are indispensable. And I plan to set up a spinning mill, and I ask you to forget economics and start studying the technology of Britain's cotton industry." Now, attached to this letter were recommendations from his father and friends. Now, what an audacious proposition that was. After giving the letter and attachment some thought, Yamanobe decided to accept Aichi Shibusawa's request, and as a first step, Takeo Yamanobe wrote his acceptance letter to Aichi Shibusawa, telling him yes, he was transferring to King's College to begin to study mechanical engineering. But once there, and he maintained his correspondence with Aichi Shibusawa, and he told him his progress, and he said he needed hands-on mechanical knowledge, not this kind of theoretical mechanical engineering knowledge, and so he had moved to Manchester. Now, Karl Marx had taken the same path in his study of the foundations of capitalism. Manchester was the center of the world's cotton production at the time. Both Karl Marx and Takeo Yamanobe visited factories. Marx had Engels to guide him because Engels owned these factories. But Takeo Yamanobe advertised in newspapers requesting employment as a trainee who was willing to pay tuition. Now, Takeo Yamanobe suffered countless rejections, but finally he encountered a mentor in the form of a gentleman named Mr. Braggs, who was the owner of a cotton textile factory. For 8 months, he learned the ins and outs of cotton spinning, from ginning, spinning, finishing to the purchase of raw cotton, the sales and marketing of finished goods, packaging, and shipping. The cost of the traineeship was covered by research funds of 1,500 yen that Shibusawa sent him, and that was a lot of money at that time. Regarding this large sum, Shibusawa remarked, "It was a leap of faith, like jumping down from the stage of the Kiyomizu Temple and hoping to land well." Takeo Yamanobe was the first Japanese to learn the latest theory and practice of cotton production. Before he set off for home, he purchased spinning machines and steam engines from Pratt & Company and Hargreaves & Company, and of course Shibusawa financed that. On his return, Yamanobe, together with Shibusawa, set about locating a site for the mill. Shibusawa had raised another 250,000 yen in capital from businessmen and nobility, and he had arranged for the operating costs to be financed from the First National Bank, of which he was president. In 1882, the Osaka Spinning Company, which we'll call OSC, was born this way. From the very beginning, the performance of the company was amazing. On the technology and management fronts, Ideas of the past had been discarded completely. Innovations featured a five-fold increase in output capacity. The use of steam power allowed locating the mill in a large urban area and not in the backwoods. This is where the workers lived and allowed round-the-clock production. The selection of goods to be manufactured was for production articles that would not compete with Britain. OSC used cotton from China as opposed to domestically grown cotton as the raw material. Now, in short order, the banker Aichi Shibusawa was financing other similar ventures where would-be Japanese capitalists had been stimulated by the rapid success of the Osaka Spinning Company. Out of nowhere came the Mie Spinning, then Kanegafuchi Spinning, then Setsu Spinning, Amagasaki Spinning, and a host of other mills modeled on OSC that I talk about in your book. We don't need to name them all here. And they sprang up all over Japan. Thus, cotton spinning grew into the main industry of the Meiji period. Now, it was not a road without obstacles. In the stock companies of Meiji Japan, including the cotton industry, the voice of shareholders that had little knowledge of industry was always harping. Such investor voices were critical when investment returns fell short of desired returns. Now, this is a common problem in most capitalist endeavors with corporate-style financing. For that matter, it would be a problem in Soviet Russia when managers became angry over government policies that negatively affected their ability to meet quotas. And in Russia's case, only the strong hand of the Communist Party leader overcame the wrath of his big bosses at and after the 1934 CPSU Bolshevik Congress of Victors. Technical experts like Takeo Yamanobe, who had a deep understanding of their industry, had different priorities than money managers. The former tended to think of long-term development of their business rather than focusing solely on short-term profit when working out production and investment plans. This was the age-old clash between owners and management. In the post-1904 recession, this confrontation between the owners and management heated up at Osaka Spinning, and this time the president and the shareholders alike criticized their chief engineer, Takeo Yamanobe, who went to Shibusawa to tender his resignation, but the banker said, "Hell no." With that emphatic backing, the engineer businessman survived to lead another day, and Yamanobe was appointed president at Osaka Spinning as a specialist who combined technical knowledge and management experience. The source of the vitality of the Meiji economy was the new social ideology of capitalism that had produced men of caliber such as Shibusawa and Yamanobe, one after another. That was the secret of the phenomenal catch-up. Meiji Japan had the policy of adopting foreign technology, but that did not include foreign direct investment. Although if done discreetly, wise foreign caps could be attracted to special investment funds with bankers like Shibusawa, who had his own policy list, and I'm not going to go through all of that, but the important thing is the Japanese Industrial Revolution was self-financed, and this is how they had acquired the capital to do that. The Meiji government leadership was committed to make government-owned enterprises the raw material skeleton for modernization by improving their performances, and initially this was done by the employment of foreign specialists and their latest machinery, but as soon as they could, they replaced these guys with the technical specialists of Japanese nationality, and in many ways it's similar to the way in which the Russians, Stalin had to use the bourgeois technicians that he had inherited because he didn't have any choice until the Bolshevik colleges graduated enough of their classless intelligentsia to take those positions. As soon as they did, and he was able to get rid of these guys. But Japan went through the same step. And just make one last step there before I conclude this lecture, because still had quite a bit of more material to go through, but I think an important point to remember is that the United States prided itself on its ignorance of Japan right up until the attack on Pearl Harbor, picturing them continuously as nearsighted, glass spectacle-wearing, stupid little monkeys. But this is not the case in Russia. The Russians had learned the fact that they'd been whipped in 1904 by a country that they had considered backward, they had internalized. And Joseph Stalin studied this as one of the intellectual leaders of the Bolshevik Party. He studied this industrialization of Japan in understood all these different steps they'd gone through. And he realized that Russia was going to have to go through the same steps. Now, we've already gone through the Russian period in lectures in the first volume and in this series of accompanying lectures. And so you know that in the period from 1924 to 1928, Stalin had to confront all of these same problems. And he had to know, not just because of what was obvious from what was going on within Russia, that they were going to have a great turn at the end of 1928 and that they could self-finance it, but he had all of this Japanese experience that he was familiar with in intimate detail, as were all Russian intellectuals, because after 1904, after Russia had been so terribly whipped, well, first of all, the first Russian Revolution in 1905 was directly triggered by this whipping that the capitalist Tsar's navy had taken off the Korean coast. And the Russian intellectuals, all of them, studied that closely, and this, of course, included the Bolshevik intellectuals. I'm going to kind of wrap this up here because I think we've hit, when you get your book, you want to take a look in all of the details that I provided about the mechanism of the training, but I think you've got the generalized picture. And in the next lecture, we're going to talk about the formation of the Japanese Communist Party and the industrial working class itself.